The air inside the old conservatory building was always the same. It was a thick soup of history, polish, and the faint, dusty scent of aging paper. For Anaya, it was the smell of dreams. Every hallway echoed with the muffled sound of a piano, a constant, overlapping symphony of students wrestling with Chopin, Bach, and Liszt. Each closed door held a different story, a different struggle, a different triumph. But for Anaya, the struggle felt more personal than most. She wasn't just a student here. She was an anomaly. She moved through the halls with a quiet grace, her worn canvas bag slung over her shoulder, carrying nothing but sheet music that was often more creased and folded than pristine. While other students marched with a sense of purposeful ambition, Anaya drifted, as if following a melody only she could hear. Her friends, if you could call them that, were the old, neglected upright pianos in the back practice rooms, the ones with slightly sticky keys and a softer, more forgiving tone. She felt a kinship with them, a sense of being slightly out of tune with the rest of the world. When Anaya played, she didn't just sit on the bench. She became part of the instrument. Her eyes would close, shutting out the world, and her body would sway. A gentle dance guided by the emotion flowing from her heart to her fingertips. She wasn't just hitting the right notes. She was trying to tell a story. A simple C major scale in her hands could sound like a sunrise, full of slow, dawning hope. A frantic passage of 16th notes wasn't just a test of speed. It was a panic, a chase, a desperate cry. This was her gift and her curse. The music lived inside her, and it demanded to be let out, its own way. This approach put her in direct opposition to the conservatory's reigning prince, a young man named Cale. Cale was everything Anaya was not. His posture was impeccable, his suits were perfectly pressed, and his fingers moved over the keys with a terrifying, inhuman precision. When he played, it was like watching a master craftsman assemble a Swiss watch. Every note was perfect, every dynamic was exactly as written, every pedal change was surgically clean. He could play the most difficult passages in the world without a single drop of sweat on his brow. The professors adored him. They would nod along, their faces glowing with pride, as he tore through a Rachmaninoff concerto with the power and clarity of a supercomputer. For them, Cale was the ideal. He was proof that their methods worked, that discipline and rigor could create perfection. Anaya would often listen from the doorway. Hidden in the shadows, a strange mix of awe and dread churning in her stomach. She admired his talent, truly she did, but she couldn't feel the music in his playing. It was beautiful, like a perfectly carved statue, but it was cold. It had no heartbeat. She knew that if she tried to play like him, she would fail. And if he tried to play like her, he wouldn't even know where to begin. The ultimate judge of these two opposing philosophies was the head of the piano department, Mr. Dmitri. He was a man carved from granite and old-world tradition. He never smiled. His eyes, sharp and gray, seemed to see right through every excuse, every ounce of laziness, every misplaced note. He would walk through the hallways like a silent storm, his hands clasped behind his back, and the students would part before him like the sea. When he entered a room, the air grew heavy. His silence was more intimidating than any shout to Mr. Dmitri. Music was not about feeling. It was about architecture. It was about structure, balance, and mathematical precision. The composer had written a perfect blueprint, and the pianist's job was to build it, exactly to specifications. Any deviation, any personal flourish, any feeling that altered the written notes was, in his eyes, an act of vandalism. He saw Anaya's emotional style not as genius, but as a lack of control, a dangerous flaw that needed to be corrected. This all came to a head during a mandatory masterclass a few weeks before the final scholarship competition. The scholarship was everything. It wasn't just about the money. It was a ticket to the most prestigious summer program in Europe, a chance to study with legends. For Anaya, whose family had sacrificed so much to get her here, it felt like her one shot to make all their struggles mean something. The pressure was a physical weight on her shoulders. One by one, students went up to perform. Cale played first, of course. He delivered a flawless, breathtaking performance of a Beethoven sonata. Mr. Dmitri gave a single, crisp nod. "Excellent," he said, his voice flat. "The structure is sound. You honored the composer's intent." It was the highest praise he ever gave. Then it was Anaya's turn. Her hands were shaking as she sat at the gleaming black Steinway. She was playing a piece by Debussy, a composer known for his dreamy, impressionistic soundscapes. It was music that seemed to beg for emotion. She started playing, and for a moment, she lost herself in it. The notes flowed, and she added a tiny, lingering pause on a particularly beautiful chord, letting it hang in the air a fraction of a second longer than written. It felt right. It felt like the music was breathing. "Stop!" Mr. Dimitri's voice cut through the air like a shard of ice. Anaya's fingers froze on the keys. The room was utterly silent. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, a mixture of pity and curiosity. "Come here," he commanded. She stood up and walked toward him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He pointed to the sheet music on the stand. "Show me," he said, his voice dangerously low, "where the composer wrote this." This hesitation, Anaya's throat went dry. He didn't, sir. It just felt—" He held up a hand, silencing her. "It felt— We are not in the business of feeling. We are in the business of music. Music is notes on a page. It is rhythm. It is structure. What you did was a lie. You lied to the audience. You told them Debussy wrote something he did not. Your feeling is an indulgence. It is a weakness." The words hit her like physical blows. She felt her face flush with heat, then go cold. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor. She saw Cale out of the corner of her eye, his expression unreadable. "Technique is the only truth," Mr. Dmitri continued, his voice ringing through the hall. "Discipline is the only path. Without them, you are just a child banging on a toy, making noise. This is a conservatory, not a nursery. Go back to your seat, and do not waste my time with your feelings again." She walked back to the piano on legs that felt like they were made of water. She couldn't finish the piece. She just sat there, staring at the keys, the music inside her silenced by a wall of shame. That night, she didn't go to the practice rooms. She went back to her small dorm room and stared at the ceiling, wondering if he was right. Maybe she was a fraud. Maybe her gift was just a lack of discipline. The scholarship competition, once a beacon of hope, now felt like a guillotine. And she was convinced she was about to lose her head. The days that followed the master class felt like walking through a fog. Anaya went through the motions of her life, but her heart wasn't in it. She attended her classes, she ate her meals in the crowded cafeteria, she even went to the practice rooms, but the music was gone. It was locked away somewhere deep inside her, behind a wall of Mr. Dimitri's words. Your feeling is an indulgence. It is a weakness. Every time she placed her fingers on the keys, she would hear his voice, and her hands would freeze. The joy had been replaced by a gnawing fear of doing it wrong, of being a fraud. The scholarship competition, which had once been a source of nervous excitement, now loomed over her like a dark cloud. A final judgment she was certain she would fail. The day of the competition's final round arrived with a strange, brittle energy. The main auditorium was filled to capacity. Students, faculty, and members of the public who had come to see the conservatory's best and brightest were all buzzing with anticipation. The stage was bathed in a warm, golden light, making the two grand pianos sitting center stage look like thrones. The air smelled of expensive perfume and the faint electric scent of the stage lights. Anaya sat in the front row with the other two finalists. Her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Beside her, Cale sat with an aura of calm confidence, his posture perfect, his gaze fixed on the stage as if he already owned it. The head judge, a renowned visiting professor, stepped up to the microphone. He welcomed everyone and spoke of the conservatory's legacy of excellence. Then he explained the final, unusual step of the competition. To truly test the mettle of our finalists, he announced, each will be assigned a specific instrument for their performance. The challenge is not only to play your piece, but to master the unique voice of the piano you are given. A murmur went through the audience. This was new. This was unexpected. First, the other finalist, a serious young woman with impeccable technique, was called to the stage. She was assigned a beautiful, newly restored Beisendorfer. When she sat down to test a few notes, the sound that filled the auditorium was pure, clear, and resonant, like ringing bells. It was an instrument that made it easy to sound good. The audience applauded politely, impressed. Then Cale's name was called. He walked to the stage with a confident stride. He was led to the conservatory's crown jewel, a gleaming black Steinway concert grand. It was the piano everyone dreamed of playing. When Cale's fingers danced across the keys for a brief sound check, the music that erupted was powerful, rich, and full of soul-stirring depth. It was the sound of perfection. A wave of appreciative applause swept through the hall. People nodded to each other. It was clear to everyone that this was the piano of the winner. Anaya's heart sank. She knew what was coming. There was only one piano left. And now, the head judge said, his voice echoing in the now silent hall, for our final finalists, Anaya, Mr. Dmitri, who had been sitting silently with the other judges, stood up. He didn't walk toward the gleaming pianos on the stage. Instead, he turned and gestured toward a dark, forgotten corner of the auditorium near the back wall, hidden in the shadows. "Your instrument is here," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. A spotlight followed his gesture, cutting through the darkness and landing on a shape that was covered by a large, dusty gray sheet. It looked like a piece of forgotten furniture, a ghost haunting the back of the room. Two stagehands walked over and, with a dramatic flourish, pulled the sheet away. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. What was revealed was not so much a piano as it was a wreckage. It was an ancient grand piano, its once beautiful wood finish now scarred with deep scratches and water stains. The color had faded to a sickly, mottled brown. One of the legs was propped up by a stack of old, yellowed books. But it was the keyboard that was truly horrifying. The keys were yellowed and grimy, some of them chipped or cracked. The black keys were worn down, the white keys stained with what looked like decades of coffee and cigarette smoke. It looked less like a musical instrument and more like a corpse. The students in the audience began to whisper. Some pointed. Others looked at Anaya with open pity. This wasn't just a hard piano. It was a broken instrument. It was a joke. A cruel, public joke. Out of the corner of her eye, Anaya saw Cale. He had a small, tight smile on his face, the look of a man who had just watched his rival be publicly humiliated. Mr. Dmitri, oafed out, walked over to the broken piano and placed a hand on its damaged lid. "This is the Colossus," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "It was once a great instrument. Now it is in disrepair. Many of its strings are rusted or broken. The hammers are worn. The action is unpredictable." He looked directly at Anaya, his gray eyes like chips of stone. "The challenge," he continued, his voice taking on the tone of a professor giving a lecture, "is not to play a perfect piece of music. The challenge is to prove that a true musician can create beauty from anything. That art is not in the tool, but in the artist. Can you bring order from this chaos? Can you make this broken thing sing?" His words sounded profound, but to Anaya, they were a death sentence. This wasn't a test of her musicality. It was a test of her ability to perform a miracle. It was a setup. It's a way for him to prove his point once and for all, that without perfect technique and a perfect instrument, he was putting her on display, not to see her succeed, but to watch her fail, slowly feeling as if she were walking to her own execution. Anaya rose from her seat and made her way down the aisle. Every step felt heavy. The whispers of the crowd felt like tiny needles pricking at her skin. She climbed the few steps to the main floor and walked across the vast, empty space to the dark corner where the Colossus waited. The spotlight followed her, isolating her in its harsh, white light. She reached the piano and stood before it. It was even worse up close. She could smell the dust and the faint, musty smell of old wood and neglect. She gently lifted the fallboard, the cover for the keys. It creaked in protest. Hesitantly, she reached out and pressed one of the middle keys. It didn't make a note. It made a dull thud like hitting a block of wood with a spoon. The key was stuck. She had to pull it back up. She tried another key, this time a little harder. A sound came out, but it was a horrible, discordant clang, like a trash can lid falling down a flight of stairs. The note was so far out of tune, it was painful to hear. A few people in the audience snickered. Anaya's face burned with shame. She tried a few more keys. Some were stuck, some made ugly thudding noises, and a few produced notes that were so warped and off-key they sounded like they were crying in pain. She looked down at the pedals. One of them was rusted solid. She pressed the other, and it let out a loud, piercing squeal. Like a frightened animal, before flopping uselessly to the floor. It was impossible. It was absolutely, completely impossible. You couldn't play music on this thing? You could barely make sounds. Mr. Dmitri hadn't given her a difficult piano. He had given her a pile of firewood and asked her to compose a symphony. The weight of the entire auditorium's gaze. The weight of Mr. Dmitri's judgment. The weight of her own dwindling hope. All came crashing down on her at once. She stood there, alone in the spotlight, a tiny, defeated figure in front of a monstrous, broken piano, and felt a cold, terrifying certainty wash over her. She was going to fail, and there was absolutely nothing she could do about it. The silence in the auditorium was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered every sound except for the frantic beating of Anaya's own heart. She could feel the hundreds of eyes on her, a mixture of pity, curiosity, cruel amusement. Mr. Dmitri's gaze was the heaviest of all, a cold, dead weight that pinned her in place. For a long moment, she just stood there, staring at the ruined keyboard as if it were a puzzle with no solution. Her mind was a blank wall of white noise. "Run!" a voice inside her screamed. Just run away and never come back. But her feet were rooted to the spot. She had come this far. She had to try. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she sat down on the worn, rickety bench. It wobbled precariously under her weight. She placed her trembling fingers on the yellowed keys, trying to remember the piece she had prepared, a beautiful and complex nocturne by Chopin. It was a piece full of longing and delicate emotion, a piece she knew she could play beautifully on any other piano. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the world, trying to find that quiet place inside her where the music lived. She began to play. The result was a disaster. The opening melody, which should have been a flowing lyrical line, was a series of disconnected, ugly thuds. Several of the keys she needed were stuck, creating awkward, jarring silences in the middle of a phrase. When she tried to play a soft, gentle chord, the sound that came out was a discordant crash, as if she had dropped a tray of metal pans. A few snickers rippled through the audience. Her face grew hot with shame. She pushed on, trying to force the music out of the broken instrument, but it was like trying to get water from a stone. The piano fought her at every turn. A fast passage meant to sound like a cascade of glittering notes became a frantic, clumsy slapping sound. The pedals, when she dared to use them, either did nothing or let out a piercing, metallic squeal that made people jump in their seats. She could feel Mr. Dmitri's eyes on her. She knew exactly what he was thinking. See? Feeling is nothing without control. Without a proper tool, your emotion is just noise. His words from the masterclass echoed in her head, louder than the horrible sound she was making. You are just a child banging on a toy. That's what she sounded like. A child. A fraud. She stumbled through another few bars, her fingers growing more clumsy, her confidence shattering with every wrong note. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. Her hands fell from the keyboard into her lap. She had failed. Just as he had planned, the auditorium was silent again, but this time it was a tense, awkward silence. The judges were whispering to each other. Anaya wanted to sink through the floor, to vanish into thin air. She felt a single hot tear escape and run down her cheek. She was about to stand up and walk off the stage to accept her defeat when something inside her snapped. It wasn't a feeling of hope or a sudden burst of inspiration. It was pure, raw frustration, anger. In a moment of quiet rebellion, She lifted her hands and brought them down hard on a cluster of the stuck dead keys in the middle of the keyboard. She didn't care about the melody or the composer or the competition anymore. She just wanted to make a noise, to release the fury and humiliation boiling inside her. But the sound that came out wasn't a noise. It was a rhythm. Thud-thumbed, 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 the three keys she had hit. All dead and unresponsive to normal playing, had produced three distinct percussive sounds. They were different pitches, different tones. One was a low, hollow thud. Another was a higher, sharper thump. The third was a flat wooden tap. It wasn't a piano sound. It was a drum sound, and Anaya froze, her hands hovering over the keys. She slowly, deliberately pressed the three keys again, one after the other. Thub, thump. Tap. She did it again, a little faster this time. Thud, dash, thump, thud, dash, thump, dash, thump, dash, thump. A beat. A primitive, compelling beat. It was the heartbeat of this broken, old machine. For the first time that night, a feeling other than despair flickered inside her. It was curiosity. She forgot about the audience. She forgot about the judges and the competition. In that moment, there was only her and this strange, broken piano. She leaned closer, her ear just inches from the keys. She started to explore, not as a pianist, but as a scientist. She pressed every single key, one by one, and listened to what it had to say. About a third of them were completely dead, producing that wooden, percussive thud. Another third were horribly out of tune, but they still made a note of some kind. The final third were the most frustrating. They were the ones that made the ugly, clanging, metallic sounds. She then turned her attention to the strings. Lifting the lid that covered the inner workings of the piano, she peered into the dusty darkness. It was a jungle of rusted wires, felt-covered hammers, and wooden mechanisms. She saw several strings that were snapped, coiled like dead snakes. Hesitantly, she reached inside, her fingers brushing against a thick bass string. She plucked it. The sound that came out was not a piano note. It was a deep, resonant buzz, like a cello being played with a metal bow. It was eerie and beautiful. She plucked another one, a thinner string. It gave off a high, ringing hum, like a tiny bell. She discovered that by gently strumming a group of the broken strings, she could create a strange, ethereal chord, a shimmering cloud of sound that hung in the air. An idea, wild and daring, began to bloom in her mind. It was so crazy it just might work. She wasn't going to play Chopin. She wasn't going to play any classical piece. This piano didn't want to tell someone else's story. It wanted to tell its own, and she was going to help it for the next 2 days. While the other finalists practiced their polished pieces on their perfect pianos, Anaya spent every waking hour in the dark corner of the auditorium with the Colossus. She stopped trying to fix it or force it. She started to collaborate with it. She used the dead keys as a drum kit, creating complex polyrhythmic beats that formed the backbone of her new piece. She used the few working out-of-tune keys to play a simple, haunting melody. The melody was sad but strong, like a survivor telling their story. And she used the broken strings inside the piano, plucking and strumming them to create atmospheric soundscapes that filled the gaps. She was no longer just a pianist. She was a composer, a percussionist, a sonic sculptor. She was finding music in the brokenness, creating beauty out of chaos. The piano that had been her public humiliation was becoming her private secret treasure. She was no longer afraid of it. She was listening to it, and for the first time it was starting to sing back. The night of the final performance felt different. The air in the auditorium wasn't just thick with anticipation. It was charged with a strange, almost morbid curiosity. Everyone knew about the Colossus. The story of Anaya being assigned the broken piano had spread through the conservatory like wildfire. People weren't just coming to hear music. They were coming to witness a spectacle, a public train wreck. The first 2 finalists had already performed. The other finalists had played a beautiful, technically perfect piece on the Beisendorfer, earning her a warm, respectful applause. Then Cale had taken the stage. His performance on the pristine Steinway was, as expected, a marvel of technical prowess. He played with a speed and a precision that seemed almost inhuman, his fingers a blur of motion across the keys. The music was flawless, a perfect glittering crystal of sound. When he finished, the audience erupted in applause, a loud, enthusiastic roar that shook the room. People were on their feet, whistling and cheering. He had, in their eyes, already won. And then it was Anaya's turn. A hush fell over the crowd as the single spotlight found her in her seat. She stood up, and a wave of whispers followed her as she walked down the aisle. She could feel the eyes on her, the pity, the smug satisfaction from those who sided with Mr. Dmitri. She kept her gaze fixed forward, not looking at anyone, her expression calm and unreadable. She wasn't nervous anymore. The past 2 days had burned away all her fear, replacing it with a quiet, fierce sense of purpose. She wasn't here to win a competition anymore. She was here to tell a story. She reached the dark corner and stood before the Colossus. The spotlight followed her, illuminating the dusty, scarred wood and the grimy keyboard. She sat down on the wobbly bench, the silence in the hall so complete she could hear her own breathing. For a moment, she did nothing. She just placed her hands on the keys, not to play, but to connect, to feel the worn ivory and the stubborn resistance of the dead keys. She closed her eyes, and the world outside the spotlight faded away. There was only her and the piano. Then she began. It didn't start with a note. It started with a beat. Her right hand began to strike a group of 3 dead keys in the middle of the keyboard. Thud-thump, thud-thump. It was a slow, steady, almost primitive rhythm. It sounded like a heartbeat, but a hesitant one, like a heart that was learning to beat again. The audience was confused. People shifted in their seats, looking at each other. A few whispered smirks passed between some of the students in the front rows. This wasn't piano music. It was just noise. But then her left hand entered. Over the steady beat, she began to play a simple, 5-note melody on one of the few working keys. The note was horribly out of tune, flat and mournful, but in the context of the rhythm, it didn't sound wrong. It sounded sad. It sounded like a lone voice singing a lament in an empty room. The combination of the raw, percussive beat and the haunting, off-key melody created a mood that was instantly captivating. The whispers in the audience died down. People leaned forward, their expressions shifting from confusion to rapt attention. The music began to grow. The rhythm became more complex, her hands moving across different clusters of dead keys, creating a polyrhythmic tapestry of sound that was both intricate and primal. She was using the piano as a drum kit, and the sounds she was coaxing from it were surprisingly rich and varied. Then, she did something that made the entire auditorium gasp. She leaned forward, reached inside the open top of the piano, and with her right hand, began to pluck at one of the broken bass strings. The sound that filled the hall was eerie and beautiful. It was a deep, resonant buzz that shimmered in the air, like a cello playing in a haunted cathedral. She continued the beat with her left hand on the keys, while her right hand danced inside the piano, plucking and strumming the broken strings, creating strange, ethereal harmonies that swirled around the simple, sad melody. The music was no longer just a beat and a tune. It was a soundscape. It was the sound of rain on a tin roof, the wind whistling through a cracked window, the ghost of a song that had been forgotten. The piece began to build in intensity. The rhythm grew faster, more urgent, like a heart beating with panic and fear. The melody became more frantic, jumping between the few working keys, a desperate cry for help. She started to use the clangy metallic keys not as mistakes, but as accents of sharp industrial pain. She was telling the story of the piano's life, its glory days, its neglect, its fall into disrepair, its loneliness in the dark corner. The music was a journey through struggle and suffering. You could hear the frustration in the harsh, percussive slaps on the keyboard and the despair in the long, buzzing drones from the broken strings. The audience was completely mesmerized. No one was whispering. No one was moving. People were literally on the edge of their seats, their faces painted with a mixture of shock, awe, and deep visceral emotion. Some had tears in their eyes. They weren't just listening to music. They were feeling a story. Even Kale, the perfect technician, was staring, his face a mask of utter disbelief. He had never heard anything like it. It was a language of music he didn't speak, a world of sound he couldn't even imagine. The music reached its climax. It was a storm of sound, chaotic, beautiful, overwhelming cacophony of rhythm, melody, and texture. It was the sound of breaking, the sound of pain, the sound of a final, desperate scream. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The storm passed. Her hands stilled. In the sudden, deafening silence, she reached inside the piano one last time and gently plucked a single, thin, broken string. A high, pure, humming note rang out, clear and fragile as a soap bubble. It hung in the air for a long, long moment, a single, perfect sound of hope amidst the ruins. Then it faded into nothing. The silence that followed was the most profound moment of the night. It lasted for a full 10 seconds. No one breathed. No one moved. It was as if the entire auditorium was holding its breath, afraid to break the spell. They were not just clapping for a performance. They were reacting to a raw, transformative experience they had just shared. Anaya sat at the broken piano, her head bowed, her hands resting in her lap, spent. She had given everything. And in the end, she had not just played the piano. She had set its soul free. The silence in the auditorium was a living thing. It stretched on, thick and heavy, a shared breath held by hundreds of people. Anaya remained seated, her head bowed, her body trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and release. She had poured every ounce of her being into that performance, into the story of that broken piano. She had nothing left. For a moment, she wondered if the silence meant they had hated it, that they were just waiting for her to leave so they could laugh. But then, a single person in the back row began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate clap, not of politeness, but of deep, profound respect. It was like a spark in a dry forest. Another person joined in, then another. Soon, a wave of applause began to build, not the polite, respectful clapping for the other performers, but something raw and powerful. It grew louder and louder until the entire auditorium erupted. It wasn't just applause. It was a roar. It was a primal scream of emotion, a release of all the tension and awe that had filled the room. People were on their feet, not just standing, but leaning forward, their faces flushed with emotion. Some were crying openly, wiping tears from their cheeks. Others were cheering, shouting, "Bravo!" at the top of their lungs. The sound was overwhelming, a physical force that washed over Anaya, warming her, healing her. She slowly looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief, and saw a sea of standing people, all of them focused on her. She had done it. She had reached them. Backstage, the atmosphere was electric. The other finalists stood in a state of shock. Kale was leaning against a wall, his arms crossed, his face a mask of utter confusion. He had played every note perfectly, and yet the raw, imperfect sounds from that old wreck of a piano had elicited a reaction he had never been able to achieve. He couldn't comprehend it. On stage, the judges were huddled together, their heads close. The visiting professor, a man known for his traditional tastes, was speaking animatedly, his hands gesturing wildly toward Anaya and the Colossus. The other faculty members nodded in agreement, their faces alight with a new kind of excitement. But Mr. Dmitri was silent. He wasn't looking at the other judges. He was staring at the broken piano, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be studying it, not as a piece of junk, but as something else entirely, something he was only just beginning to understand. Finally, the head judge returned to the microphone. The audience slowly settled back into their seats, a low buzz of anticipation filling the air. "We have reached a decision," he began, his voice filled with a newfound energy. This was, without a doubt, one of the most remarkable evenings this conservatory has ever witnessed. The level of talent on this stage has been extraordinary. He first announced the third-place winner, the other finalist, who came forward to accept her award with a gracious smile. Then he paused. The runner-up, for a performance of stunning technical brilliance and virtuosity, he looked directly at Kale. "Is Kale?" polite, but noticeably less enthusiastic, round of applause followed. Cale walked onto the stage, his face a stoic mask. He shook the judge's hand, but his eyes kept flicking over to Anaya, who was still standing in the wings, her heart pounding in her chest. There was only one prize left. The head judge let the silence hang for a moment. "And the winner of this year's scholarship," he said, his voice ringing with conviction, "for a performance that redefined the very meaning of music, for showing us that true artistry lies not in perfection, but in the courage to find beauty in the broken, is Anaya." The second roar was even louder than the first. It was an explosion of pure joy. Anaya felt a pair of gentle hands on her back, guiding her onto the stage. The world felt like a dream. The lights were too bright, the sounds were too loud. She walked forward in a daze, accepting the heavy certificate and the handshake from the beaming judge. She looked out at the sea of faces, all smiling, all cheering for her. She saw her friends from the practice rooms, their faces filled with pride. She saw the stern old theory professor, a rare smile on his lips. And then she saw him. Mr. Dmitri had left the judge's table and was standing at the edge of the stage. He wasn't clapping. He was just watching her, his gray eyes no longer cold and judgmental, but filled with a look of deep, thoughtful contemplation. Later, after the crowd had dispersed and the stage was being cleared, Anaya found herself alone in a quiet hallway, clutching her award. She still felt like she was floating. Suddenly, a figure approached her. It was Cale. He stopped a few feet away, looking uncharacteristically unsure of himself. "I don't understand what you did," he said, his voice quiet. "It wasn't correct. The notes were wrong. The technique was non-existent." He shook his head as if trying to clear it. "But it was the most real thing I've ever heard. It was unreal." He looked at her, a genuine, unguarded look of respect in his eyes. "You didn't just play the piano? You made it alive. Congratulations." He gave a small, stiff nod and walked away, leaving Anaya more stunned than before. Then she saw Mr. Dmitri walking toward her. Her old fear tried to resurface, a flicker of the old dread, but it was quickly extinguished by the events of the night. He stopped in front of her, his tall figure casting a long shadow. He didn't smile. His face was as serious as ever, but his eyes were different. "Anaya," he said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't offer congratulations. He didn't apologize. Instead, he looked past her, toward the dark corner of the auditorium where the Colossus still sat. "For 40 years," he said, almost to himself, "I have taught students to build perfect structures, to follow the blueprint, to honor the composer." Turned his gaze back to her. "Tonight, you did not honor the composer. You did something else. You gave a voice to the voiceless. You took a broken thing and you gave it a story." He paused, choosing his words with care. "I came here tonight to judge a pianist. Instead, I witnessed an artist." He took a small step closer. "You did not master the piano. You liberated it." He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent understanding passing between them. It was the greatest validation she could have ever received. It wasn't an apology, but it was something far more profound, a shift in his entire worldview, triggered by her music. He gave a single, slow nod, then turned and walked away, his back straight, his steps as measured as ever. In the weeks that followed, Anaya's performance became the stuff of legend at the conservatory. The Colossus was no longer a joke. It was moved from the dark corner and given a place of honor in the main lobby, with a small plaque that read "The Instrument That Sang." Students began to experiment in ways they never had before. They started exploring the sounds inside their pianos, using unconventional techniques, and learning that a mistake could sometimes be a doorway to a new kind of beauty. The definition of music had been expanded, and Anaya had been the one to expand it. She had won the scholarship, a ticket to a world of new possibilities. But she had won something much more valuable that night on the stage. She had proven to herself and to everyone else that her feeling was not a weakness. It was a different kind of strength. She had learned that the most powerful music doesn't always come from the most perfect instruments, but from the courage to embrace the flaws to find the story in the scars and to make the whole world listen.